Storm Before the Storm, The Beginning of the End of the Roman Republic by Mike Duncan. So a couple of quick disclaimers before I jump into the review. Disclaimer number one, I'm sorry about my voice. I don't know if you can hear it. You can probably hear it. I'm recovering from a cold this week and from a sore throat and a bit of a lost voice. Slightly better now than it was 2 days ago, but you can still kind of hear it. In an ideal world, I should probably wait a couple more days before filming this video, but this is likely the only free night I'm going to have this week. So I just have to take advantage of it when it comes up. I'm busy with job and the kids and stuff like that. Disclaimer number two, I actually finished this book about a month and a half ago during a Tet holiday up here in Vietnam. And I've not had time to get around to doing the review until now. It's not as fresh in my mind as it would have been had I filmed this video a month and a half ago. But I think there's still more than enough to talk about. And like I said, I've got kind of a bad voice anyway, so maybe it's just as well if this video doesn't go on forever. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into this. Excuse me. So Mike Duncan is a podcaster. I've talked about him actually a lot on this channel, and I'll try and remember to link to the videos in the description down below in which I've talked about him. He did the History of Rome podcast. And, it's a classic podcast story if you're not familiar with it. He just started it up one day in his garage, and it had like a few friends and family members listening to it. But then as the podcast kept going, it accrued a larger and larger audience until it had quite a following by the end of it. And then after finishing the History of Rome podcast, he went on to do Revolutions podcast. So the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, etc. He is, like a lot of podcasters, an amateur, or at least he started out as an amateur. He doesn't have a PhD in history. He's got a Bachelor's of Political Science with a minors in philosophy. He did go back to do a master's after finishing the History of Rome, master's in public history, but I'm not sure he actually finished it. On his website, it sounds like he gave that up to go be a stay-at-home dad and follow his wife out to Wisconsin. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you know. Did he finish the master's? At any rate, if you're at all familiar with his podcasts, you know that despite not having the credentials, he obviously reads voraciously, is quite intelligent about what he reads, and is able to digest it into an engaging narrative framework, which is what he does every week on his podcast, or what he did. Both podcasts are actually finished now. Excuse me again. There will be some coughing throughout this video. Apologies in advance. So after finishing his History of Rome podcast, he went on to the Revolutions podcast, and apparently while he was doing that, he got contacted by a literary agent who wanted to know if he had any ideas for a book, and he said he did. And so he went back and he did The Storm Before the Storm, which is, as the subtitle suggests, about the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. So let's jump back here. The end of the Roman Republic. I guess everybody knows Caesar and the Rubicon and the Ides of March and Et tu, Brute and all that kind of stuff. But there was about 100-year period that's called kind of the Civil War period, or sometimes it's called like the Crisis of the Roman Republic, or something like that, which starts with the Gracchi brothers in 130 BC and goes, depending on how you count it, either with Caesar's assassination in 44 BC or with Augustus Caesar finally consolidating power after the Battle of Actium. I don't remember when, sometime around 30 AD. No, not 30 AD. When would that have been? 15 AD? I don't remember. Anyways, so there's this whole long period of instability before the Republic finally collapses, beginning with the Gracchi brothers. During that period, I think the stuff that's most familiar to modern audiences is Cicero and Caesar and Pompey and Crassus and Brutus and Antony and Cleopatra and all that drama. But Mike Duncan says in his introduction that because there are so many books about that period already, he thought it would be interesting to take a step back and do a book about the generation before Caesar and Crassus and Pompey and Antony and Cleopatra. So starting with the Gracchi brothers in through the dictatorship of Sulla, which is still part of this period of the collapse of the Republic, but it's the first half of that period, not the second half of that period. The generation right before Caesar. He says in his author's introduction here, what does he say? The critical generation that preceded that of Caesar, Cicero, and Antony, that of the revolutionary Gracchi brothers, the stubbornly ambitious Marius, and the infamously brash Sulla, is neglected. We have long been denied a story that is equally thrilling, chaotic, frightening, hilarious, and riveting as that of the final generation of the Republic. This book tells that story. Now, I'm going to quibble slightly with that. I really loved this book on the whole, and I will give it a very positive review. But to quibble slightly, I don't think Sulla and Gaius Marius, and certainly the Gracchi brothers, I don't think they have been neglected. There are plenty of books about them. Not quite as many books about them as there are about Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, granted, but they've not been completely neglected. There was, just relatively recently, there was a Tom Holland book, Rubicon, which also started with the Gracchi brothers and went through Marius and Sulla. But by the way, it's an extremely readable book if you ever come across it. Now, Rubicon, Tom Holland's book, kept going right through the age of Caesar and kind of told the whole story. Now, Rubicon was a bit longer, so it had more room to tell a longer story. But The Storm Before the Storm is obviously only focusing up through Sulla. So I guess that's what makes this book unique is that he stops right at Sulla's dictatorship, and there's a brief epilogue where he kind of hints at what's going to come in the next generation. But for the most part, this book stops with Sulla's dictatorship. So it's only that generation, stopping short of Caesar. This is a period of Roman history which I am quite interested in myself, and in fact I've talked about it before on this channel, and try and remember to link to the videos in the description down below in which I talked to it. Also, I've talked about it on my blog before. I'll try and link to those book reviews down below as well. It's something I just find fascinating for a few different reasons. One is this is a period of Roman history which we know a lot about. Now, the age of Marius and Sulla and the Gracchi brothers, a little bit less so than the next generation, but we still have a few different ancient sources on this, so you can tell an interesting story about it. another reason I find it so interesting is because, well, it's naturally interesting. It's a period of great social and political upheaval when there was a lot of social turmoil and political battles. Um, but then there also appears to be an ideological battle going on in this period between the conservative elite and the reformers. And that arguably seems to mirror some of the politics of the modern day. Now, I am not a professional historian. I just read popular histories as a hobby. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I believe that serious historians are a little bit reluctant to read too much modern day politics back onto ancient Rome. Um, so you maybe have to be a little bit careful here, but there does, depending on which history you read, there are these labels that were apparently being thrown around during this time. One was optimate, which was I think it literally in Latin means the best men, and it was used to describe the conservative aristocracy that was protecting the old privileges of the Senate. So the conservative faction of of the ideological battle during this time. And the others were the populares, the populace, who were the radical reformers during this time. Now, again, I think this is something that serious historians treat with caution because it's not clear in the ancient sources what exactly these terms mean. Do they mean like a political party? Or do they mean like an ideology? Or do they just mean like a style of politics? Or are these just kind of slurs that get thrown around a bit? It's I think there's some debate about it. But that being said, a number of popular histories of this period do present it as if they are two opposing political parties. Um, and Mike Duncan kind of leans into that interpretation. This is a period of ideological battle between the conservative optimates and the radical populares. Now, I've watched a couple interviews with Mike Duncan. And in some of the interviews, he is more nuanced. He says, well, it's difficult to map modern day politics back onto ancient Republican Rome. And there he talks about how Roman ancient Republican Roman politics were based on the client patron system. So there was these rich patrons, and they had a bunch of clients who were dependent on them for money. And that was the basis of a lot of the political alliances during this period. And as you can see, that would cut across class lines because the clients, even though they were from a lower class, were supporting the political interests of their patron who was from a higher class, which makes it difficult to do like a Marxist class war analysis of this. I think in one of the interviews he gives, Mike Duncan says that it was more like different clans clashing than it was like a Marxist class war. And he does mention that briefly in this book. But having mentioned that, he then kind of leans in. He mentioned that, and then he kind of forgets about it. After having mentioned it, then he does kind of lean in to this, this idea of some sort of class war going on here. I mean, the leaders of both factions came from the Roman nobility. So the populares were also Roman nobles, but they were Roman nobles who chose to champion the cause of the poor. They were class traitors, maybe to use it in Marxist terms. And there are a couple points in here in which Mike Duncan portrays the populares as proto-Jacobins almost. Jacobins, of course, being from the French Revolution. And, at the time he was writing this book, he was working on his Revolutions podcast. And I don't know exactly when he started this book, but it was roughly about the time he was doing the French Revolution, or just after he had finished the French Revolution is when he started working on this book. So there are references. For example, there's a populari politician who sets up these special courts in which he uses them to try his political enemies in. And Mike Duncan compares them to the revolutionary trial courts in the French Revolution, and says, it wasn't quite that bad, but it was close. It was the same kind of thing, like one of the revolutionary courts. There's another part where there's again, this is actually the same guy, a populari politician, Saturninus, who starts a riot against the nobility, but in the course of the riot, a different populari politician is killed. And the irony is, this other guy who got killed has spent his whole life trying to court the lower classes and court that populari vote, but he ended up getting killed by them in this riot. And Mike Duncan says the revolution was now beginning to eat its own, which is another reference to the French Revolution. That's another famous quote from that French Revolution. So that aspect of things, the populares as being revolutionaries, radicals, proto-Jacobins, is leaned into a bit during this book. And it's, who knows what a serious historian would make of it. I think this is the kind of thing you could debate back and forth about it. But I think it is debatable. Again, take everything I say with a grain of salt, because I'm not a serious historian myself. But the impression I get is that Mike Duncan might not be wrong. I mean, he might not be right either. But you could argue his view. He presents a view that could be argued from the historical sources. And so it's kind of interesting to imagine this ancient Republican Rome as kind of like a distant mirror in which the modern day political divisions between left and right seemed mirrored and the ancient Rome Republican divisions. So I tend to enjoy books like this, which play up that analysis angle. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I tend to enjoy contemplating it. The other thing which is, I guess, interesting to think about is when you talk about the collapse of an ancient republic, how much of this is a warning to modern day America, or how much of this mirrors modern day America. In the introduction, Mike Duncan says that he specifically chose this time to focus on. Well, he chose it for two reasons. One is because there's already been enough written about Julius Caesar already. But the second reason is, he says, I don't think we're at the Caesar period yet in American history. He says, he says, if America is anywhere parallel to Republican Rome, which it may or may not be, but if it is, he says, we're not at the Caesar period yet, and we're not at the beginning period yet. He says, we're probably at the period right where we've conquered the world. And now we're dealing with an influx of wealth into our republican institutions, and that's a period of Roman history where this book starts out. So The Roman army has conquered the Mediterranean by this point. There's a huge influx of wealth pouring in. So I mean, it used to be the Roman government was run by was made up of these austere middle class Republican farmers, but all this money has been pouring in now, and you can kind of see maybe similarities to the American current day system, where America's more or less conquered the world for the time being, and until the rise of China, and all this money is now pouring in from globalization. But what happened in Republican Rome, as Mike Duncan describes, is that money was not going to the poor people. It was all going to the rich nobility, and it was not trickling down. They were hoarding that money, and they were using that money to buy up the land. So now the Roman middle class, the Republican farmer, is getting squeezed off of their own land and can't afford to live anymore. And arguably, you could make this case that this is what has been happening in America, where this huge influx of wealth has not benefited the middle class, but made it more difficult for the middle class to get property and home ownership and all this kind of stuff. I'm not an economist, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But you can see those arguments, right? And then the other thing that Mike Duncan talks about repeatedly throughout this book is that as the political polarization increased, the kind of the traditional unwritten rules of politics started to disintegrate. So there was kind of the thing that broke down first was not the letter of the law. He talks about the Gracchi brothers, and the Gracchi brothers presented their bill directly to the assembly instead of having it go through the Senate first for debate and advisory. And Mike Duncan said there's actually nothing illegal about this. There's actually nothing that said you couldn't present your laws directly to the assembly. But it had never been done before. And then one of the other tribunes vetoed the reading of the bill, so it couldn't get voted on. And Mike Duncan again says a tribune had every right to do that. Tribunes can veto anything at any time for any reason. But he said no tribune had ever done this before. They'd never, I guess in the past they had symbolically vetoed bills for a short time, but then they'd always withdrawn their veto once they'd made their statement. But in this case, the tribune just vetoed the bill and kept the veto. So another thing which was technically legal but had never been done before. So then Tiberius Gracchus had the assembly's vote to depose the tribune, which was maybe legal. It seems to be a gray area in Roman law, but it had never been done before. So all these things which were kind of technically legal, but just it wasn't the way the system usually functioned. And again, with kind of the breakdown in American politics since 2016, you can maybe see all these things which are not technically illegal. I mean, you can also see some things that are illegal, but there are also a lot of things which are not technically illegal, but it's just not the way things have worked before, right? Not the way that the government has functioned in the past. So those two things to me seem to be the big standout from this book, and there can be other things we can talk about. By the way, I should mention when I'm talking about Roman politics and how a bill becomes a law and stuff like that, I should mention Mike Duncan's analysis of the political systems here is interesting, and if you've listened to his podcast, his History of Rome podcast or his Revolutions podcast, he does a pretty good job of explaining the nuts and bolts of government systems, like how the French, what was it? How the revolutionary, what was it? The public safety, right? The during the French Revolution, how the Committee of Public Safety actually operated, what was its powers, where did it come from? And those kind of things throughout his podcast. He gives good little succinct explanations of how these systems work. Given how many books I've read on Roman history, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I don't think I ever really had a clear idea of the process by which a bill becomes a law in Republican Rome. I think I thought that the Senate voted on laws. And I didn't actually realize that it was the tribal assemblies that voted on laws, and the Senate was just acting as like a advisory committee or like a debating club that would debate the merits of the law before giving them on to the assembly. Never realized that before, but Mike Duncan, I think, does a good job of explaining just what the nuts and bolts of these procedures are. And there's an interesting thing. This was not a big part of the book, but on pages 8 and 9, he's talking about the Greek political philosopher Polybius, who had this theory about how the Roman Republic was actually the perfect system because it combined some elements of monarchy, meaning the councils, some elements of aristocracy, meaning the Senate, and some elements of democracy, meaning the tribal assemblies. And it said like Polybius had come out of the Aristotelian political philosophy, which believed that democracy, monarchy, and aristocracy all had their good and bad points, but left alone, each one would degenerate towards its most repressive form. So Polybius thought that the Romans had kind of finally beaten the system by instituting this government which had balanced everything perfectly. Of course, Mike Duncan mentions that to show that actually, by the time Polybius had written this, everything was beginning to fall apart. The balance was beginning to fall apart in Republican Rome. But I still thought that was a really interesting analysis. It takes up about 2 pages. So again, it's a kind of thing where it's long enough for you to for Mike Duncan to break it down a bit and for you to digest it. But it's short enough where it doesn't go on and on forever. It's just like this little bite-sized little political philosophy from the ancient world. And I think that's the other kind of thing Mike Duncan is good at. I should have actually, speaking of things Mike Duncan is good at, I should have mentioned this right at the top of this review, but the primary reason you'd want to pick up this book is just because it's a nice, well-written narrative history. And if you're familiar with Mike Duncan's podcast, you know that already. He's got the ability to tell a story well, and so there are some. This is a narrative history. He tells the story. He tells the history as a story, and he tells it well. The other book about the same period, which is also a really good narrative history, telling history as a story, is Rubicon by Tom Holland. Now, Rubicon I read 9 years ago. And so when I was preparing this review, I tried to go back to it. I don't have a copy anymore, but I read some of the samples online, like the Google Books preview or something like that. Tried to compare the 2 books a little bit. Trying to figure out which one was better. And I couldn't make up my mind. They're both very well-written narrative histories, which are just fun to read. I think there are some key scenes in Rubicon by Tom Holland that are written very well, and maybe some of those key scenes are better than Mike Duncan. But aside from those, really well done paragraphs, from what I could jog my memory with, I think that just the most of the prose of Rubicon is about equal to the prose of The Storm Before the Storm. But this is kind of a silly discussion, anyways. Like, which one is better? They're both good. Read them both. I mean, this is the kind of thing. I don't really have to recommend this book to you, do I? If you're a history nerd, if you're the kind of person who knows already that they're interested in this kind of stuff, then this is a well-written book and you'll enjoy it, and you don't need me to recommend it to you. I mean, all I can say is that it's well written. So if you're interested in the subject, you will enjoy it. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't like history, well, then you already know that this book isn't for you. But if you do like history, check out this book. It's very well written and very interesting.